The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday, slipped beneath the apartment door while she was at work, its presence announced only by the white corner visible against worn linoleum when she returned home that evening. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway, grocery bags cutting into her palms, and stared at that corner for several seconds before her daughter's voice pulled her back. "Mom, I'm hungry." She set the bags down carefully, as if sudden movement might make the paper more real, and crossed the small space in 3 steps. The notice was official, impersonal, its language dressed in the formal politeness that accompanied most forms of institutional rejection. 30 days. Failure to remit payment. Legal proceedings. The words blurred together as her vision swam, not from tears, but from the sudden pressure behind her eyes that came when the body recognized a threat it could not immediately fight. Behind her, Emma, 7 years old, and observant in the way children become when stability is always uncertain, had stopped asking about dinner. Sarah could feel her daughter's gaze, could sense the question forming even before it was spoken. She folded the notice once, then again, until it was small enough to fit in her pocket, and turned with a smile that felt like lifting something heavy. "Let's make spaghetti tonight, the good kind, with the sauce you like." Emma's face brightened, doubt retreating in the presence of routine. Sarah moved to the kitchen, her hands steady as they opened cans and boiled water, on her mind already calculating with a precision born from years of making impossible numbers stretch further than they should. The rent was 3 months overdue. Her paycheck from the diner covered food, barely, and the electricity bill that had its own final notice tucked in a drawer she tried not to open. The car needed repairs she couldn't afford, and Emma's school had sent home a form about supplies and field trips that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the access it represented. She had been a graphic designer once, in what felt like a different lifetime. She had worked in a bright office with floor-to-ceiling windows, had created campaigns that appeared on billboards, had earned enough to feel secure. Then the industry shifted. Algorithms replaced intuition, and the layoffs came in waves. She survived the first 2, then the third, and when the 4th arrived, it found her alone, 6 months pregnant, and suddenly aware of how little the safety net extended when you needed it most. The years that followed had been a series of compromises, each one reasonable in the moment, each one eroding a little more of what she had once taken for granted. The apartment grew smaller. The job grew harder. The distance between what she wanted for Emma and what she could provide widened until it felt like standing on opposite sides of a river she could see across, but never cross. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, its screen dim to conserve battery, and scrolled through job listings that required experience she didn't have or education she couldn't afford to continue. The familiar weight of exhaustion settled into her shoulders, but she kept searching, kept clicking, kept hoping that somewhere in the endless scroll an answer would appear. It was nearly midnight when she found the auction listing. She had drifted into a section of the site she didn't usually visit, where people sold estates and liquidated businesses, where the language shifted from practical to desperate. The photograph was poor quality, taken from a distance, with a phone camera that struggled with the scale of the object. A submarine, or what remained of one, lay partially submerged in shallow water near a decommissioned naval facility. Rust darkened its hull, and vegetation clung to exposed sections like the sea reclaiming what had once been taken from it. The description was brief. Decommissioned research vessel. Sold as is. Salvage rights included. Must be removed from current location within 60 days of purchase. Starting bid, $300. Sarah stared at the image, her exhaustion making the scene feel unreal. Who bought submarines? Who even thought to look for such things? The absurdity of it pulled a laugh from her chest, quiet and humorless. She was looking at eviction notices and submarine auctions in the same night, as if her life had become a surreal joke with no punchline. She almost closed the tab, almost returned to the job listings and the careful calculus of survival. But something about the image held her attention. Perhaps it was the strangeness of it, the way it existed so far outside the ordinary struggles of rent and groceries, that it felt like a door to somewhere else. Perhaps it was simply that she was too tired to be sensible. She clicked through to the auction details. 2 bids had been placed, pushing the price to $550. The auction closed in 18 hours. The listing had been active for 2 weeks, which meant most people had scrolled past it without pause, recognizing it for what it was: a liability, a burden, a problem someone else was trying to solve by passing it along. Sarah read the description again, slower this time. Salvage rights. The words carried an implication she couldn't quite articulate, a suggestion that value might exist somewhere beneath rust and decay. Scrap metal had worth. Components could be sold. Even if the submarine itself was worthless, surely the materials that composed it weren't. She opened a new tab and began to research. The hours passed without her noticing. The apartment silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street below. She learned about decommissioned vessels, about the bureaucracy that surrounded military surplus, about scrap metal prices and salvage operations. The information accumulated slowly, each piece adding to a picture that was incomplete, but not entirely discouraging. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky, she had convinced herself of 2 things. First, that the submarine, if she could access it, held enough salvageable material to cover several months of rent. Second, that the risk of spending money she didn't have on a bid might be less dangerous than the certainty of eviction. The logic was thin, held together by exhaustion and desperation, but it was logic nonetheless. She placed a bid. $600. It was more than she had in her account, but she had a credit card with a small limit, one she had kept for emergencies. If this wasn't an emergency, she didn't know what was. The confirmation screen appeared, bright and impersonal. Your bid has been placed. She closed the laptop and sat in the growing light, not quite believing what she had done, not quite able to regret it yet. When Emma woke an hour later, Sarah was still at the table, her coffee cold, her thoughts tangled in the space between reckless and necessary. She made breakfast and got her daughter ready for school, the motions automatic, her mind elsewhere. At work, she moved through her shift in a daze, pouring coffee and clearing tables, while her phone sat heavy in her pocket, its silence both reassuring and unbearable. The notification came during her afternoon break. Our congratulations. You are the winning bidder. Sarah stared at the words until they stopped making sense, then read them again. She had bought a submarine. The absurdity of the statement should have frightened her, but instead she felt a strange calm, the kind that came after a decision had been made and could no longer be unmade. She had 60 days to remove it from its current location. 60 days to turn rust and desperation into something that might save her. She told no one at first, not her coworkers, not the neighbor who sometimes watched Emma, not the few friends who still checked in occasionally with messages she rarely had energy to answer. The purchase felt too fragile to speak aloud, too vulnerable to the judgment she knew would follow. But secrets in small lives rarely stayed contained. A week after the auction closed, she mentioned it to her sister during a phone call that had started with careful questions about money and ended with Sarah's defenses too worn to hold. You bought a what? The disbelief in her sister's voice was sharp enough to sting. Sarah explained, haltingly, about the scrap value, about the salvage rights, about the calculations she had made in the dark hours of early morning. Her words sounded weaker aloud than they had in her head, and she could hear her sister's silence stretching into something heavy. Sarah, that's insane. You don't know anything about salvage. You don't have money for this. What were you thinking? The question hung between them, and Sarah had no answer that wouldn't sound like desperation dressed up as a plan. She ended the call soon after, her sister's concern lingering like a weight she couldn't set down. The word spread in the way such things do, slipping from person to person until it reached neighbors and acquaintances who had never asked about her struggles, but were suddenly eager to comment on her choices. At the diner, a regular customer who worked in construction brought it up with a smirk that didn't quite hide his pity. Heard you're going into the submarine business? That's one way to solve your problems, I guess. His friends laughed, and Sarah smiled in a way that kept her face from showing what she felt. She refilled their coffee and moved to the next table, her hand steady, her thoughts sharp with humiliation. They didn't know about the eviction notice. They didn't know about the nights she lay awake calculating which bills could be delayed and which couldn't. They saw only the absurdity of a single mother buying something ridiculous, and their judgment was easy, uncomplicated by context. Emma heard about it at school. Another child, whose parent had heard from someone else, asked her if her mom really bought a submarine. Emma, proud and defensive in the way children are when they sense their parent being questioned, said yes. The laughter that followed made her cry, and when Sarah picked her up that afternoon, her daughter's face was puffy and closed. Why did you buy something that makes people laugh at us? The question broke something in Sarah's chest. She knelt in the school parking lot and pulled Emma close, feeling her daughter's small body rigid with hurt. She wanted to explain about desperation and calculated risks, about how sometimes the absurd choice was the only one left. Instead, she said the only thing she could. Because I'm trying to take care of us. And sometimes that means doing things other people don't understand. Emma didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. They drove home in silence, the weight of judgment settling into the car like a passenger they couldn't leave behind. That night, Sarah lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to Emma's breathing through the thin wall. The mockery stung more than she wanted to admit. She had expected doubt, even criticism, but the casual cruelty of it surprised her. People spoke about her purchase the way they might discuss a bad movie or a foolish bet, entertainment drawn from someone else's struggle. She thought about backing out. The submarine sat waiting, unclaimed, while the 60-day deadline ticked closer. She could walk away, accept the loss, and return to the familiar calculus of survival. The eviction would proceed. They would move to something smaller, cheaper, further from Emma's school. She would find another job, maybe two, and the cycle would continue, tightening with each turn. Or she could go see the submarine, actually look at what she had bought. The thought terrified her, but the alternative, surrendering to the mockery and her own doubt, felt worse. 3 weeks after the auction closed, she arranged for her neighbor to watch Emma and drove north on roads that narrowed as the city fell away behind her. The decommissioned naval facility sat at the edge of a wide bay, its buildings low and weathered, its fences rusted in places where salt air had worked steadily for decades. A guard at the gate checked her name against a list and waved her through without comment, or his expression suggesting he had seen stranger things pass through those gates. She followed the directions sent by the auction house, her car bumping over uneven pavement, past empty lots and buildings with boarded windows. The place felt abandoned, not dramatically, but in the slow way things were left when no one had reason to return. She parked near a concrete dock and stepped out into wind that tasted of brine and diesel. The submarine lay ahead, partially submerged at the far end of a shallow inlet. From this distance, it looked smaller than she expected, diminished by rust and the water that had claimed its lower half. She walked closer, her shoes crunching on gravel, and the scale of it shifted. It wasn't small, it was simply defeated, a relic of purpose stripped away. The hull bore markings faded beyond legibility. Hatches sat sealed with corrosion. The conning tower rose at an angle, tilted where the seafloor had settled unevenly beneath the weight. Sarah stopped at the water's edge and stared, her earlier calculations suddenly feeling fragile. This wasn't just scrap metal waiting to be harvested. This was a structure that had resisted entropy longer than she had been alive, and now it lay in shallow water, too heavy to move, too complex to dismantle without knowledge she didn't possess. For a long moment, doubt won. She could see the mockery justified in the rusted hulk before her. What had she been thinking? What desperate logic had convinced her this was salvageable? Then she noticed the detail that would change everything. Near the waterline, where the hull met the surface, a section had buckled inward, creating an opening large enough to access the interior. Rust had eaten through the metal in places, and vegetation clung to the edges, but the gap was there, dark and patient. Sarah didn't decide to enter so much as she found herself moving toward it. She waded into the water, the cold shocking through her jeans, and reached the hull. The metal was rough beneath her hands, pitted and sharp in places. She pulled herself up onto a section that sat above the waterline and peered into the opening. Darkness greeted her, absolute and still. She turned on her phone's flashlight, and the beam cut into the interior, revealing a corridor that extended inward, its walls slick with moisture. The air that rose from the gap smelled of rust and stagnant water, metallic and old. She knew she should turn back. She had no equipment, no training, done no safety measures beyond a phone that would die if she dropped it. But the opening pulled at her, and the memory of Emma's hurt face pushed from behind. She needed to see, needed to know if there was anything here worth the humiliation she had endured. Sarah lowered herself through the gap carefully, her feet finding purchase on what felt like a metal grating. The corridor beyond was narrow, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Water pooled on the floor, and rust flaked from the walls at her touch. She moved forward slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping ahead, revealing chambers and passages that branched into deeper darkness. The submarine had been stripped of most equipment, its interior hollow, where instruments and machinery had once filled every space. What remained were the bones of it, the structural elements that couldn't be easily removed. Pipes ran along the ceiling, bulkheads divided sections, and everywhere, rust claimed surfaces with patient inevitability. She passed through what might have been crew quarters, the walls bearing marks where bunks had been bolted. A galley sat empty, its surfaces stained. Deeper still, she found chambers, whose purposes she could only guess at. Spaces filled with shadows, and the steady drip of water finding its way through compromised seals. It was in the aft section, where the corridor narrowed and the ceiling lowered, that she found the hatch. It sat flush with the floor, nearly invisible beneath a layer of grime and corrosion. She might have missed it entirely if her foot hadn't caught on the raised edge, nearly sending her sprawling. Sarah knelt and brushed at the surface with her hand. The metal beneath the dirt was different from the surrounding hull, smoother, more deliberate. A wheel sat at the center, designed to unseal whatever lay below. She gripped it and pulled, expecting resistance, but the mechanism turned with surprising ease, as if it had been maintained long after the rest of the submarine had been abandoned. The hatch lifted on hinges that barely protested, revealing a vertical shaft descending into darkness. A ladder, its rungs slick with moisture, led downward. Sarah aimed her flashlight into the space and saw metal gleaming at the bottom, reflective in a way that didn't match the rust above. Every instinct told her to stop. She was alone, in an unstable structure, in water she couldn't see the bottom of. One wrong step, one sealed passage flooding, and no one would find her until it was far too late. Emma would be left with a neighbor, waiting for a mother who would never return. the final cruelty of a choice made in desperation. But the gleam at the bottom of the shaft held her attention, refusing to be dismissed as reflection or illusion. She had come this far. She had endured the mockery and the doubt. Walking away now felt impossible. Sarah descended the ladder one careful rung at a time, testing each before committing her weight. The shaft was perhaps 12 feet deep, ending in a small chamber that felt more like a vault than a room. The walls here were different, reinforced, sealed with materials designed to resist water and time. And at the center, bolted to the floor, sat a metal case unlike anything she had seen above. It was roughly 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, so its surface clean, almost pristine. No rust, no corrosion. The seals around its edges looked intact, and the lock mechanism at the front bore a complexity that suggested value beyond ordinary storage. Sarah crouched beside it, her hands trembling as she examined the case without touching it. This was not scrap. This was not abandoned equipment. This was something preserved, hidden in the deepest part of a vessel that had been left to rot. Someone had placed this here deliberately, had maintained it even as the submarine above decayed, and then had walked away. She tried the lock, not expecting it to yield, but the mechanism was damaged, corroded in places where water had found its way past the seals. With pressure applied to the right points, it gave way with a sound that echoed in the small chamber. Sarah lifted the lid slowly, her breath shallow, her mind racing through possibilities. The case opened to reveal layers of foam padding, custom cut to hold objects of specific shapes. And nestled within those shapes, catching her flashlight beam and throwing it back in fragments of brilliance, were diamonds. They lay arranged in rows, each one resting in its own indentation, separated and protected. Sarah stared, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Not a handful. Not a collection for personal use. Hundreds of them. Thousands, perhaps. Some small and uniform, others larger and more irregular, their surfaces cut and polished to angles that caught light and held it. She reached out with one shaking hand and lifted a single diamond from its resting place. It was cold, heavier than she expected, and in the beam of her flashlight, it seemed to burn with an inner fire. She set it down carefully and lifted another, then another, each one confirming that what she was seeing was real. The case held more than gemstones. Beneath the top layer, she found documentation sealed in waterproof pouches, certificates of authenticity, appraisals dated years earlier, manifests listing weights and grades in technical language she didn't fully understand. The numbers beside each entry were staggering, written in formats that suggested institutional value rather than individual ownership. Sarah sat back on her heels, the documentation trembling in her hands. This wasn't salvage. This wasn't scrap metal that might cover a few months of rent. This was something else entirely. Something that changed the shape of every calculation she had made. The vault chamber seemed to close in around her as the implications settled. Someone had hidden this. Someone had placed a fortune in a decommissioned submarine and then left it. Whether by choice or by force, she couldn't know. The auction listing had made no mention of contents. The photographs had shown only rust and decay. Whoever sold the submarine either didn't know what it contained or had known and said nothing. She thought of the mockery, of the neighbors who had laughed, of her sister's disbelief. They had seen desperation buying garbage. They hadn't seen this, couldn't see this. The gap between their perception and the truth was so vast, it felt unreal. Sarah closed the case carefully and sat in the dim light of her phone, her thoughts spinning. She needed to get out, needed to secure this chamber, and needed to think clearly about what came next. But movement felt impossible, as if stepping away from the case might make it disappear. Time stretched in the small space, minutes becoming elastic and uncertain. When she finally forced herself to stand, her legs trembled with more than cold. She climbed the ladder slowly, emerged into the corridor above, and made her way back through the submarine's darkened passages. Each step felt surreal, as if she were moving through a dream that might collapse at any moment. The opening where she had entered appeared ahead, light spilling through from the world outside. She pulled herself through and stood on the hull, blinking in brightness that felt too sharp. The bay stretched out around her, peaceful and ordinary. Gulls circled overhead. Water lapped at the submarine's sides. Nothing about the scene suggested that anything had changed. But everything had changed. Sarah stood dripping on rusted metal, her phone clutched in one hand, and felt the world tilt beneath her. She had bought a submarine for $600 because she had nowhere else to turn. And in doing so, she had found something that would alter the course of her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The drive back to the city passed in a blur. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel with careful precision, her mind replaying the moment the case opened, the diamonds catching light, the documentation confirming their value. She wanted to believe it was real, but belief felt dangerous, a trap that might spring shut if she allowed herself to fully trust it. She picked Emma up from the neighbor's apartment, nodding through questions about how the trip went, offering vague answers that satisfied without revealing. That night, after her daughter fell asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, the blue glow illuminating her face as she searched for information she should have sought weeks ago. Diamond appraisal, gemstone authentication, legal ownership of found valuables. The searches led her deeper into a world of specialized knowledge, of regulations and precedents, of questions about salvage rights and asset discovery that had no simple answers. The more she read, the clearer it became that what she had found existed in legal territory she didn't understand. The certificates she had seen suggested institutional provenance. The sheer quantity implied purpose beyond personal collection. This wasn't a hidden inheritance or a forgotten safe deposit box. This was something larger, something that had been removed from circulation deliberately. Sarah's excitement began to curdle into anxiety. Possession wasn't the same as ownership. Discovery didn't grant automatic right. If the diamonds had been stolen, hidden, or otherwise obtained through means that violated law, then finding them made her not a beneficiary, but a complication. She needed advice, needed someone who understood the legal frameworks that governed such things. But approaching a lawyer meant revealing what she had found, and revelation meant losing control of information that felt fragile and dangerous. For 3 days, she sat with the knowledge alone, going through the motions of work and parenting, while her thoughts returned constantly to the vault chamber beneath the bay. She told no one. The temptation to share, to release the pressure of secrecy was constant, but she resisted. The mockery she had endured taught her caution. People who had laughed at her buying a submarine would not react better to news of what it contained. On the 4th day, she called a maritime lawyer, whose name appeared in multiple search results. The initial consultation was brief, conducted over the phone while Emma watched cartoons in the next room. Sarah described the situation in careful terms, omitting specifics about value and location, framing it as a hypothetical question about salvage law. The lawyer's response was measured, but not discouraging. Salvage rights, properly executed, granted significant claims to discovered assets. The auction listing had included salvage terms, which meant Sarah had legal standing to contents found within the vessel. However, complications existed if the assets in question had been stolen, concealed from creditors, or otherwise obtained through illegal means. If you found something of value, the lawyer said, her tone professional, you'll want to establish provenance quickly. Document everything, secure the site, and be prepared for the possibility that others may claim interest. Sarah thanked her and ended the call, her anxiety only partially relieved. She had standing, but standing wasn't the same as certainty. The path forward required steps she couldn't take alone. She returned to the submarine the following week, this time with a borrowed camera and a determination to document everything thoroughly. The facility guard waved her through again, recognition in his nod suggesting he had seen her before and found nothing remarkable in her repeat visit. She parked in the same spot and approached the hull with growing familiarity. The interior felt less threatening this time, her earlier passage having mapped routes through the darkness. She descended to the vault chamber and spent hours photographing the case, the diamonds, the documentation. Each image was carefully framed, time-stamped, geotagged. She created a record that could not be easily disputed or dismissed. When she emerged again, the sun had shifted lower, casting long shadows across the bay. Sarah stood on the hull and looked out at the water, feeling the weight of what came next settle onto her shoulders. She had the proof. She had legal standing. What she didn't have was protection from the consequences that would follow once this became public. That evening, back in her apartment, she composed an email to the lawyer, attaching selected images and requesting a full consultation. She hesitated before hitting send, knowing that this action would begin a process she couldn't stop. Then she thought of the eviction notice, now less than a week from its deadline. She thought of Emma's face when other children laughed. She thought of the years spent calculating which bills could be delayed and which couldn't. She sent the email. The response came the next morning, faster than she expected. The lawyer wanted to meet in person. Urgently. The tone suggested both opportunity and complication, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she read the brief message requesting her availability. They met in an office overlooking the city, glass and steel rising into a sky that threatened rain. The lawyer, a woman in her 40s, with a directness that Sarah found reassuring, reviewed the documentation with an expression that shifted from professional interest to carefully controlled surprise. "This is significant," she said finally, setting down the last of the images. "Not just in value, but in implication. These diamonds, if they're genuine, and if the certifications hold, represent a collection that should have records, should have a chain of custody. The fact that they were hidden in a decommissioned military vessel suggests either criminal activity or an attempt to conceal assets from legal claims." Sarah had known this already, but hearing it stated plainly made her hands go cold. "Does that mean I can't keep them?" "It means we need to establish their history before any claim of ownership will stand. If they were stolen, they'll be returned to the original owner or their insurer. If they were hidden to avoid creditors, those creditors may have claims. If they were part of a criminal operation," the lawyer paused, "then this becomes complicated in ways that may put you at risk." The word hung in the air between them. Risk. Not opportunity. Not salvation. Risk. "What should I do?" The lawyer leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in thought. "First, we secure the site completely. No one else can access that chamber. Second, we engage an independent appraiser, someone with credentials that will hold up under scrutiny. Third, we begin the process of historical research, tracing the submarine's ownership, its decommissioning, any records of contents or anomalies. And fourth," she met Sarah's eyes, "we prepare for the possibility that this will attract attention you may not want." Sarah thought of the mockery, of the casual cruelty she had already endured. If this became public, if the value became known, the attention would not be limited to neighbors and acquaintances. It would draw others, people for whom a fortune in diamonds was worth more than judgment. "I need this to be legal," Sarah said quietly. "I need it to be right. Not just for me, but for my daughter." The lawyer nodded. I respect, showing in her expression for the first time. Then we do this carefully, step by step, and we document everything so thoroughly that no one can claim otherwise. They spent the next 2 hours outlining a plan. The lawyer would handle legal research and communications with relevant authorities. Sarah would maintain physical access to the submarine and coordinate with security at the facility to ensure the vessel remained protected. An appraiser would be engaged within the week, pending verification of credentials and confidentiality agreements. When Sarah left the office, the rain had begun, light and steady. She stood on the sidewalk and let it touch her face, feeling the cold shock of it ground her in the moment. Somewhere beneath a bay, in a chamber designed to resist time, a fortune waited. And she, who had been mocked for buying garbage, held the only key to its future. The walk back to her car felt longer than it was, each step carrying her further into a reality that still felt impossible. She had spent so long calculating survival in increments of days and dollars that thinking in terms of millions felt like speaking a language she had never learned. The gap between where she had been that morning and where she stood now was too vast to cross in understanding alone. But Emma would have a home. That thought, more than any other, made the impossible real. The appraiser arrived on a Thursday morning when fog still clung to the bay, softening edges and muting colors until the world felt suspended between water and air. Dr. Patricia Morrison was not what Sarah expected. She had imagined someone severe, clinical, perhaps dismissive of a discovery made by someone with no credentials. Instead, the woman who stepped from the black sedan was in her 60s, dressed practically in waterproof boots and a jacket designed for fieldwork rather than offices. "Ms. Chen?" She extended a hand, her grip firm. "I understand you found something unusual." The lawyer had arranged the meeting with careful discretion, sharing only what was necessary to secure Dr. Morrison's interest, while binding her to confidentiality agreements that carried significant penalties for breach. Sarah had read those agreements twice, trying to understand the legal language, and had been reassured only by the lawyer's calm insistence that this was standard protection for discoveries of uncertain provenance. They walked together toward the submarine doctor, Morrison's gaze sweeping across the facility with an attention to detail that suggested she was cataloging everything she saw. At the water's edge, she stopped and studied the vessel for a long moment, her expression neutral. "Decommissioned research sub," she said, more to herself than to Sarah. "Early 80s design, if I'm reading the whole configuration correctly. Unusual to see one in this condition. They're typically scrapped more thoroughly." Sarah led her to the opening in the hull, explaining the route she had taken, the condition of the interior, the location of the vault chamber. Dr. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a weatherproof notebook she produced from her jacket pocket. The descent into the submarine felt different with another person present. The silence that had pressed against Sarah during her solitary visits was broken by the sound of 2 sets of footsteps, 2 patterns of breathing. Dr. Morrison moved with practiced caution, her flashlight beam sweeping methodically across surfaces, pausing on details Sarah had stopped noticing. When they reached the vault chamber and Sarah opened the hatch, Dr. Morrison descended the ladder without hesitation, her movements efficient and sure. Sarah followed, and in the close space they stood together, the case between them like an altar awaiting judgment. "May I?" Dr. Morrison gestured toward the case. Sarah nodded and stepped back. She watched as the appraiser opened the lid with gloved hands, her expression shifting from professional interest to something more intense. The diamonds caught the beam of her flashlight and held it, each stone becoming a point of fractured brilliance in the dim chamber. Dr. Morrison said nothing for several seconds. She reached into her bag and produced a loop, a small jeweler's tool that she held to her eye as she examined individual stones without removing them from their foam beds. Her breathing slowed. Her movements became more deliberate. Sarah felt her own chest tighten as the silence stretched. "Ms. Chen," Dr. Morrison said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "Where did you say you purchased this vessel?" "At auction, online, 3 weeks ago." "And the listing made no mention of contents?" "None. It was sold as is, for salvage." Dr. Morrison straightened, lowering the loop. "These are not replicas. These are not industrial diamonds. What you found here is a collection of natural gemstones, on many of them exceptional quality." She paused, choosing her words. "I'll need to conduct thorough testing to provide official certification, but my preliminary assessment is that you're looking at somewhere between $200 and $300 million worth of diamonds." The number fell into the small chamber like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward in Sarah's mind until she couldn't track them all. 200 million. 300 million. The figures were so far beyond her experience that they felt abstract, disconnected from the reality of rent and groceries and eviction notices. "That's not possible," Sarah heard herself say. "It's improbable," Dr. Morrison corrected gently. "But it's not impossible. Collections like this exist. They're assembled for various reasons: investment, insurance against currency collapse, criminal enterprises seeking portable wealth. The question isn't whether this is valuable, it's where it came from, and whether anyone else has a legal claim to it." Sarah sat down on the chamber floor, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The lawyer had warned her about complications, about the possibility that the diamonds might be claimed by others. But hearing the value spoken aloud made those complications feel crushing rather than merely concerning. Dr. Morrison knelt beside her, her voice softening. "I know this is overwhelming, but you've done something remarkable by documenting this properly and seeking legal guidance before acting. Many people wouldn't have. That restraint may be what protects your claim. How long will the testing take?" "For full certification, 2 to 3 weeks. I'll need to transport selected samples to my lab under secure conditions. The documentation you've already photographed will help establish chain of custody." She paused. "But Ms. Chen, I need to tell you something else. A collection of this size, with these characteristics, will attract attention once it becomes known. And it will become known. Certification requires disclosure to certain oversight bodies. Insurance requires reporting. Your claim, no matter how legally sound, will be scrutinized by people who specialize in finding grounds to dispute such things." Sarah had known this in abstract terms, but hearing it stated plainly made fear settle deeper into her chest. "What kind of people?" "Insurers who paid out claims on stolen gems, law enforcement investigating trafficking, on salvage companies who may dispute the terms of your purchase, and individuals who believe, rightly or wrongly, that they have a prior claim." Dr. Morrison's expression was kind, but unflinching. "You're going to need more than a lawyer. You're going to need security, financial advisors, possibly law enforcement protection. This is no longer about finding something valuable. It's about surviving what happens next." The drive back to the city felt longer than it ever had. Sarah's hands trembled slightly on the wheel, adrenaline finally catching up with her after holding steady through the appraisal. Dr. Morrison had taken samples, 3 diamonds selected from different sections of the case, each photographed and logged before being sealed in containers designed to prevent tampering. The documentation process had taken hours. Every step recorded, every detail preserved. When Sarah finally pulled into her apartment parking lot, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that felt too beautiful for the turmoil churning inside her. She sat in the car for several minutes after turning off the engine, trying to compose herself before facing Emma. The neighbor who watched her daughter met her at the door with a curious expression. "You had some visitors today. Men in suits. Said they needed to speak with you about a business matter." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Did they leave names?" "One left a card." The neighbor produced it from her pocket, and Sarah took it with hands that had started trembling again. The card was simple, professional. "James Whitmore, Senior Claims Investigator, Continental Insurance Group." She thanked the neighbor and collected Emma, who chattered about her day, while Sarah's mind raced through implications. Insurance investigators. Already. Dr. Morrison had warned her about disclosure requirements, but Sarah hadn't expected anyone to move this quickly. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah called the lawyer. The conversation was brief and pointed. "They're fishing," the lawyer said. "Someone at the auction house likely maintains relationships with various interested parties. A submarine sold for salvage, suddenly requiring specialized appraisal? That creates questions. Don't speak to them without me present. What do they want? To establish whether the diamonds in your possession match stones, reported stolen or lost in insurance claims. If they do, the insurance company that paid out will argue they retain ownership rights." Sarah felt the weight of those words settle over her. "And if they match? Then we fight. Salvage law is complex. Prior claims aren't automatically superior to finder's rights, especially when the original owners failed to secure their assets properly." The lawyer paused. "But Sarah, I'm not going to lie to you. This will get harder before it gets easier. You need to be prepared for that." The next day, 2 more visitors appeared. These were from a salvage company that specialized in underwater recoveries. Their questions focused on the submarine's condition and whether Sarah had contracted with professionals for the removal she was required to complete. Their interest seemed genuine until one of them asked, almost casually, whether she had found anything unusual during her inspections. Sarah deflected, citing pending legal matters, and they left with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. That evening, the lawyer called to inform her that word was spreading faster than anticipated. A maritime law firm had filed a motion requesting disclosure of all assets found within the vessel, citing precedents in admiralty law that favored institutional claims over individual salvage rights. "Who are they representing?" Sarah asked. "They won't say yet. But the motion references historical ownership chains, which suggests they believe they can connect the diamonds to a previous owner or transaction." Sarah felt trapped in a current moving faster than she could swim. She had found something extraordinary, but the discovery was pulling her into waters she didn't understand, unpopulated by entities, with resources and knowledge she couldn't match. The following week brought a restraining order from a federal court, temporarily freezing any action on the diamonds, pending investigation into their provenance. Sarah sat in the lawyer's office and read the document with growing despair. "This is standard procedure," the lawyer assured her. "They're not taking the diamonds from you. They're ensuring no one can move them while ownership is disputed. How long will that take?" "Months, possibly longer." The lawyer's expression was sympathetic. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but the fact that multiple parties are filing claims actually works in your favor. If 5 different entities believe they have rights to these diamonds, it suggests no single claim is definitive. That ambiguity strengthens your position as the finder." Sarah wanted to believe that, but belief required energy she didn't have. The eviction deadline had passed. She had negotiated a temporary extension with her landlord by explaining she had assets in legal dispute, but the extension was fragile, dependent on good faith that could evaporate at any moment. Emma noticed the stress in ways Sarah tried to hide. Her daughter grew quieter, more watchful, asking fewer questions, but observing everything with eyes that missed nothing. One night, as Sarah tucked her in, Emma spoke into the darkness. "Are we going to be okay?" The question broke something in Sarah's chest. She sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed her daughter's hair, choosing her words carefully. "I'm working very hard to make sure we are, and I think we will be. But it might take time, and it might be scary sometimes." Because of the submarine? Because of what was inside it, which turned out to be more complicated than I expected. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do the people at school know?" Sarah's heart clenched. "I don't think so." "Why?" "Some of them still laugh, but I don't care anymore. Because you were right. Sometimes you have to do things other people don't understand." Sarah pulled her daughter close, feeling tears threaten for the first time since this began. She had worried about protecting Emma from the mockery, from the uncertainty, from the weight of decisions made in desperation. But her daughter was stronger than she had given her credit for. "I love you," Sarah whispered. "I love you too, Mom." The investigation into the diamond's history took shape slowly, as a piece together from fragments scattered across decades. Dr. Morrison's certification confirmed the preliminary assessment. $308 million worth of natural diamonds, categorized by grade and origin. The documentation found in the case traced back to a private collection assembled in the late 1970s by a consortium of investors operating in southern Africa. The consortium had dissolved in the mid-1980s amid allegations of smuggling and tax evasion. Several members had been prosecuted. Assets had been seized. But a significant portion of the collection had never been recovered, listed in law enforcement databases as missing, presumed hidden, or sold through black market channels. The submarine connection emerged through archived naval records. The vessel had been commissioned for legitimate research, but had been reassigned multiple times, passing through different commands and jurisdictions. During a 3-year period in the early 1980s, it had been under the nominal control of a private contractor with ties to the dissolved consortium. That contractor had disappeared shortly after the submarine was decommissioned, and subsequent inquiries into his activities had produced no results. "Someone used the submarine as a vault," the lawyer explained during one of their increasingly frequent meetings. "They hid the diamonds during its active service, probably with cooperation from crew members who were compensated for their silence. When the vessel was decommissioned, they either couldn't retrieve the stones or chose not to, out gambling that the submarine would be scrapped without anyone discovering what it contained." "So who owns them now?" Sarah asked. "That's what everyone is trying to establish. The original consortium's creditors have filed claims. The governments involved in the prosecutions have filed claims. Continental Insurance has filed claims based on policies that covered losses from that period. And then there's you, with salvage rights properly documented and executed." Sarah felt exhausted by the complexity. "What are my actual chances?" The lawyer met her eyes with an honesty Sarah had learned to appreciate. 50-50, maybe better. Salvage law is designed to reward those who recover lost assets, especially when those assets were abandoned or inadequately secured. The fact that the diamonds were hidden in a vessel sold without disclosure of contents strengthens your position. But the value involved means every party will fight hard, and litigation of this scale can take years. I don't have years. I know. Which is why we're going to explore settlement. The concept of settlement felt both pragmatic and like surrender. Sarah listened as the lawyer outlined the strategy. Engage all parties in negotiations, acknowledge the complexity of claims, and work toward a division that gave everyone something while avoiding the cost and uncertainty of prolonged litigation. "You won't get the full $300 million, the lawyer said bluntly. "But you could walk away with enough to change your life permanently. Enough to give your daughter the stability you've been fighting for." Sarah thought about that number. The full value felt impossible anyway, too large to be real. But a fraction of it? Even 10% would be more money than she could earn in several lifetimes. 20% would be transformative. Anything above that felt like abundance she couldn't even conceptualize. How long would settlement take? Months, but we could negotiate interim arrangements. An advance against your eventual share, enough to address immediate needs. The word immediate made Sarah laugh, a sound edged with something close to hysteria. Her immediate needs included rent, food, keeping Emma's school fees current. Those needs felt microscopic compared to the sums being discussed, yet they were the difference between survival and collapse. Like negotiations began in earnest 3 weeks later. Representatives from each claiming party gathered in a conference room that felt deliberately neutral, its walls bare, its table large enough to seat everyone with space between. Sarah sat with her lawyer, facing attorneys for the creditors, the governments, the insurance company, and a salvage firm that had appeared late in the process, claiming some connection to the contractor who had vanished decades ago. The discussion was technical, focused on legal precedents and percentage calculations. Sarah understood perhaps half of what was said, the rest washing over her in waves of jargon. But she watched faces, tracked reactions, and began to understand the dynamics at play. The creditors wanted resolution more than maximum recovery. The governments wanted to avoid negative publicity. The insurance company wanted to minimize payout, and the salvage firm was bluffing, their claim weaker than they pretended. After 4 hours, the room broke for lunch. Sarah and her lawyer walked outside into air that felt shockingly clean after the conference room's recycled atmosphere. "They're going to settle," the lawyer said quietly. "The question is how much. What do you think?" "I think you hold more power than they want to admit. They need you to agree. And you have the one thing none of them can claim: physical possession under documented salvage rights." She smiled. "Don't let them see you sweat." The negotiations stretched across 2 more days, each session chipping away at positions until a framework emerged. The proposal offered Sarah 43% of the certified value, with the remainder divided among other claimants, according to a formula that satisfied no one completely, but was acceptable to everyone pragmatically. 43% of $308 million. Sarah did the math on a napkin during a break, her hand shaking as she wrote the numbers. $132,440,000. Minus legal fees, taxes, and various other deductions she didn't fully understand. But even after everything was subtracted, she would be left with more money than seemed real. "We can push for more," the lawyer said, reading her expression. "This is a negotiation. They expect counteroffer." Sarah stared at the number on the napkin. A week ago, she had been calculating whether to pay electricity or buy Emma new shoes. Yesterday, and she had eaten ramen for dinner to save money. This morning, she had received another notice from the landlord, warning that the extension was nearing its end. "I want to accept," Sarah said quietly. "Sarah, we can likely get you to 50% if we hold firm." "I know, but I don't want to risk it. I don't want to spend another year fighting while my daughter watches me stressed and scared." She looked up at the lawyer. 43% is more than enough. It's more than I ever dreamed possible. I want to accept." The lawyer studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll draw up the acceptance with conditions protecting your interests. You're making a smart choice, Sarah. A lot of people in your position would get greedy and lose everything." The final settlement took 3 weeks to formalize. Some lawyers reviewed documents, accountants verified valuations, and financial institutions established frameworks for distribution. Sarah signed papers until her hand cramped, each signature binding her to agreements she barely understood, but trusted her lawyer to have negotiated fairly. The day the first transfer cleared into an account established in her name, Sarah sat in the bank, and stared at the balance displayed on the screen. The number was so large it seemed like a mistake, like someone had accidentally added too many zeros. The banker, a woman in her 50s, who had processed the transaction with professional composure, smiled at Sarah's expression. "It's real," she said gently. "You should speak with our wealth management team. They can help you protect this and make it work for your future." Sarah nodded, unable to form words. She thought of the eviction notice, now irrelevant, the diner job she could quit, the years of calculating and compromising and choosing between bad options and worse ones. All of it rendered instantly obsolete by numbers on a screen. That evening, she picked Emma up from school, as she always did, parked in the same spot, waited with the same cluster of parents. But everything felt different, separated from her old life by knowledge that hadn't yet changed her external circumstances, but had completely altered her internal landscape. Emma climbed into the car and chattered about her day, and Sarah listened with an attention that felt heightened, as if she were experiencing this ordinary moment from a great distance. When they arrived home, she parked and turned to her daughter. "Emma, I need to tell you something important." Her daughter's expression grew serious, ready for bad news. Sarah realized she had conditioned her child to expect difficulty, to brace for hardship. The understanding hurt. The submarine had something inside it, something valuable. And after a lot of work and a lot of complicated legal things, we're going to be okay now. More than okay. We're not going to have to worry about money anymore. Emma blinked. Really? Really? Does that mean we don't have to move? It means we can stay here or move somewhere better, whichever you want. Emma thought about this, her 7-year-old mind processing possibilities. "Can we get a dog?" Sarah laughed, tears finally spilling over. "Yes, we can get a dog." That night, Sarah lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, waiting for relief to arrive. She was safe. Emma was safe. The future that had seemed so fragile was now secured by resources she couldn't exhaust in multiple lifetimes. But instead of relief, she felt unmoored, as if the struggle that had defined her life for so long had been the thing holding her in place, and without it, she was drifting. She thought about the mockery, about neighbors who had laughed, and relatives who had questioned her judgment. The vindication she expected to feel was absent, replaced by something more complex. They had been right to doubt. The purchase had been reckless, made from desperation rather than wisdom. That it had succeeded didn't make the decision any less risky. She had gambled everything on a submarine she knew nothing about, and only extraordinary luck had made that gamble pay off. The uncomfortable truth settled over her as sleep finally approached. She hadn't been brave. She had been desperate, and desperation had carried her across a threshold where bravery never would have. The discovery hadn't vindicated her judgment. It had revealed how close she had come to losing everything, and how easily fortune could have turned the other way. But Emma would have a dog, and a home, and opportunities that wouldn't require calculation of which essential thing to sacrifice. That mattered more than vindication. Word spread slowly at first, then rapidly. The settlement included confidentiality clauses, but money of that magnitude left traces that speculation could follow. Sarah's former co-workers heard something. Neighbors noticed changes. The sister who had called her insane called again, her tone different, carefully neutral in ways that felt worse than the earlier disbelief. Sarah fielded these contacts with increasing weariness. Some people congratulated her genuinely. Others asked for loans, framing requests as investments or opportunities. A few distant relatives she hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembered family ties. Each interaction felt transactional in ways that made her retreat further into privacy. The diner gave her 2 weeks' notice, the manager apologetic but firm. Someone had complained that she was taking a job from someone who needed it, now that she was wealthy. Sarah didn't argue. She collected her final paycheck and walked out without ceremony, the door closing behind her on a chapter of her life that had been defined by constant motion and perpetual shortage. Emma's school treated her differently, too. The teacher who had once looked at her with pity now smiled with calculated warmth, mentioning fundraisers and building campaigns in ways that felt pointed rather than casual. Sarah made a donation, sizable enough to be meaningful, but small enough not to encourage further requests, and made plans to find a different school where wealth wouldn't mark her daughter as different. Dr. Morrison called to check in, their conversation brief but warm. "How are you handling it?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "Everything's changed, but I still feel like the same person who bought a submarine out of desperation." "That's because you are the same person. Money changes circumstances. It doesn't change character." Dr. Morrison paused. A lot of people in your situation would have tried to hide the discovery, to keep everything for themselves. You sought legal guidance and proper documentation. That integrity will serve you better than the money ever could. Sarah wasn't sure she believed that, but she appreciated the words nonetheless. The process of rebuilding her life took unexpected forms. She moved to a neighborhood where Emma could walk to a school with programs Sarah had only read about. She hired a tutor to help her daughter catch up in areas where previous schools had failed her. She established trusts and investments on advice from financial planners who spoke of generational wealth and legacy planning, concepts that felt foreign but important. But the weight of judgment remained. News of the discovery eventually reached local media, reported in terms that made her sound either extraordinarily lucky or somehow suspicious. And online comments ranged from congratulatory to accusatory, strangers debating whether she deserved what she had found, whether the settlement was fair, whether someone like her should have that much money. Sarah stopped reading the comments after the first few days, but she couldn't unhear what she had already seen. The mockery had evolved. Before, people had laughed at her for buying garbage. Now they resented her for succeeding. The common thread was judgment, and she was learning that no outcome would satisfy those determined to critique her choices. 3 months after the settlement cleared, Sarah stood in the apartment she was preparing to leave and looked around at the space that had witnessed so much struggle. The leak stain on the ceiling had been repaired. The eviction notice was long gone. But the memories remained, sharp and uncomfortable, reminders of how close she had come to losing everything. She thought about the submarine, still resting in shallow water at the decommissioned facility. Her obligation to remove it had been satisfied through payment to a salvage company, the vessel now their problem rather than hers. She had visited it one last time before signing those papers, standing on the hull and looking down at the opening that had changed her life. The diamonds were gone now, distributed among claimants, according to percentages negotiated in conference rooms far from this bay. But the chamber remained, empty and dark, a space that would hold its silence long after everyone who knew its secret had forgotten. Sarah had climbed down one final time, descended the ladder to the vault, and stood in the chamber where fortune had waited. She didn't know what she was looking for. Closure, perhaps, or confirmation that it had all been real. What she found instead was emptiness, profound and absolute, and a realization that the discovery had been the easy part. Living with what came after would require different courage entirely. As she prepared to leave the apartment and move into a life she still couldn't quite believe was hers, Emma appeared in the doorway, her arms full of boxes containing belongings that would follow them to their new home. "Mom, are you okay?" Sarah turned and smiled, genuine this time. "Yeah, sweetheart, I am." "Are you sad to leave?" Sarah looked around the apartment one last time, at walls that had witnessed desperation and calculation, and the kind of hope that had nowhere else to go. No, but I want to remember what it felt like to be here, so we don't forget. Emma nodded, wise beyond her years in the way children of struggle often were. Because of the submarine? Because of what it taught us. That sometimes the thing everyone laughs at is the thing that saves you. And that being right doesn't always look the way people expect. They finished packing in comfortable silence, mother and daughter working together to close one chapter and prepare for the next. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythms, unaware that in one small apartment, a woman who had bought a submarine for $600 was preparing to step into a future that would be built on foundations stronger than mockery, deeper than luck, and more enduring than judgment could ever diminish. The past was behind them now. The future waited, uncertain, but no longer fragile. And in between lay the present moment, ordinary and profound, where life continued regardless of fortune's favor, asking only that they keep moving forward, one careful step at a time. The new house sat on a quiet street where trees lined the sidewalks and children played without the watchful tension Sarah had grown accustomed to in her old neighborhood. It was not ostentatious. She had been careful about that, aware that visible wealth would invite questions she wasn't ready to answer. But it was solid, spacious, with a yard where Emma could run, and rooms that held light instead of shadow. The first night they slept there, Sarah lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds. The house settled differently than the apartment had, its creaks softer, more confident. Through the window, she could see stars unobscured by street lights, and the silence carried a quality she had forgotten existed. The absence of sirens, shouting, the constant background hum of struggle compressed into small spaces. Emma had fallen asleep immediately, exhausted by the move and the excitement of choosing which room would be hers. Sarah had watched her daughter explore the house with wonder, touching walls as if to confirm they were real, and had felt something shift inside her chest. This was not just shelter. This was permanence. The kind that didn't come with eviction notices or calculations about which bills could be delayed. The vindication she had expected to feel remained elusive, replaced instead by a cautious gratitude that felt almost superstitious. She was afraid to celebrate too loudly, as if fortune might notice and reconsider its generosity. The money sat in accounts managed by professionals who spoke of diversification and long-term growth, concepts that felt borrowed from a language she was still learning to speak. But the immediate changes were undeniable. She had paid off every debt, watching balances drop to zero with a satisfaction that was almost physical. The car was repaired properly for the first time in years. Emma's school supplies were purchased without calculation. And when her daughter asked about the dog they had discussed, Sarah said yes without hesitation. And together, they went to a shelter where Emma chose a gentle mutt with sad eyes and a tail that never stopped wagging. The dog, named Charlie, adapted to their new life faster than either of them. He claimed the sunny spot by the living room window and followed Emma everywhere with devoted patience. Watching them together, Sarah felt a tightness in her chest ease slightly. This was what stability looked like. Not just money, but the freedom to say yes without weighing consequences. The news of the settlement had traveled through networks Sarah hadn't realized existed. Stories appeared in financial publications first, dry accounts of legal disputes and salvage claims that mentioned her only as an individual purchaser. But details leaked, as they always did, and eventually local media picked up the story with headlines that made her wince. Single mother strikes fortune in submarine purchase. Local woman discovers hundreds of millions in abandoned vessel. The $600 gamble that changed everything. Each version of the story emphasized different elements: her financial struggles, the mockery she had faced, and the improbable nature of the discovery. Sarah read them with growing discomfort, recognizing the facts while feeling distant from the narrative they constructed. The articles made it sound like a fairy tale, a story of reward for perseverance. They missed the desperation, the recklessness, the absolute terror she had felt when climbing into that submarine, knowing she had gambled money she couldn't afford to lose. The reactions from people who had known her before began arriving in waves. Some sent messages of congratulation that felt genuine, expressing happiness for her and Emma. Others reached out with barely concealed envy, their words careful, but their meaning clear. A few were openly hostile, suggesting she didn't deserve what she had found, that luck wasn't the same as merit. Sarah's sister called on a Tuesday evening, her voice tentative in ways it hadn't been since they were children navigating their parents' divorce. "Sarah, I saw the news. I don't even know what to say." "You could start with, 'I was wrong,'" Sarah said, then immediately regretted the sharpness in her tone. A pause. Then, "I was wrong. I should have supported you instead of judging. I was scared for you, but I expressed it badly." The apology was incomplete, hedged with justification, but it was more than Sarah had expected. She felt the anger she had been carrying soften slightly. "It was crazy. You weren't wrong about that. I just got lucky." "No," her sister said firmly. "You took a risk when you had no other options. That takes something I'm not sure I would have had. I'm sorry I made you feel worse about it." They talked for an hour, Tana carefully navigating around resentments and misunderstandings accumulated over years. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. And when Sarah hung up, she felt lighter than she had in months. The diner where she had worked closed 3 weeks after she left, a victim of rising rents and declining patronage. Sarah heard about it through a former coworker who called asking if she needed household help. The request was phrased delicately, but the need behind it was unmistakable. Sarah said yes, offering a salary that made the woman on the other end of the line go silent with relief. More requests followed. People she had worked with, served, passed on the street during years of anonymous struggle suddenly remembered her name and her circumstances. Some asked for loans, others for investments in businesses or ideas that existed only in outline. Sarah found herself learning to say no, a skill she had never needed when she had nothing to give. But she also learned to say yes strategically. She established a scholarship fund at Emma's old school, designated for children whose families were struggling with basic expenses. She donated to food banks and housing assistance programs, writing checks that represented more money than she had earned in entire years of her former life. Each donation felt like sending something back across a divide she had crossed but never wanted to forget. The town's reaction to her newfound wealth was complex and uncomfortable. Some people treated her with deference that felt false, their earlier mockery forgotten or reframed as concern. Others maintained distance, as if prosperity might be contagious in ways they didn't trust. And a few approached with genuine warmth, acknowledging both her struggle and her success without making either feel like judgment. It was 6 months after the settlement when Sarah encountered the man from the diner, the regular customer who had made the joke about submarines. She was in a grocery store, reaching for produce, when she heard his voice behind her. "Ms. Chen? I don't know if you remember me." She turned. He looked older somehow, though barely any time had passed. His expression was difficult to read, not quite apologetic, not quite friendly. "I remember," Sarah said neutrally. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "I wanted to say, I heard about what happened with the submarine, and I wanted to apologize for what I said back then. It was cruel, and you didn't deserve it." Sarah studied him, trying to determine if the apology was genuine or performative. His discomfort seemed real, at least. Thank you for saying that. For what it's worth, I tell people now that I knew you when, that you were braver than any of us realized. The statement irritated her more than the original mockery had. I wasn't brave. I was desperate. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. Maybe. But you did something with that desperation instead of just enduring it. That counts for something. After he left, Sarah stood in the produce section longer than necessary, thinking about his words. The vindication she had expected to feel at such moments never quite materialized. Instead, she felt a strange flatness, a recognition that his apology changed nothing about the past and added little to the present. The mockery had hurt, but his revised opinion of her mattered even less. What mattered was standing in a grocery store without calculating the cost of every item. What mattered was buying the good produce, the kind she used to pass by because it was $3 more expensive. What mattered was knowing Emma was safe at home with a tutor who was helping her catch up in math, and that Charlie was probably asleep in his sunny spot, and that none of it would disappear because of a single unexpected expense. Emma's transformation was more visible than Sarah's. She grew more confident, her shoulders straightening in ways Sarah hadn't realized they had slumped. The new school challenged her, but she rose to meet those challenges with determination that broke Sarah's heart with pride. She made friends who invited her to birthday parties and play dates, normalcies that had been luxuries in their old life. But Emma also remembered where they had come from. One evening, while helping Sarah prepare dinner, she asked a question that had clearly been building for some time. "Mom, why do some people have money and some people don't?" Sarah set down the knife she had been using and considered her answer carefully. Sometimes it's because of the work they do. Sometimes it's because of luck or family. And sometimes it's because of systems that aren't fair, that make it harder for some people to get ahead, no matter how hard they work. Which one are we? We're the luck kind. I worked hard, but a lot of people work hard and never get the break we got. That's why we need to be careful with what we have and share it when we can. Emma thought about this, her face serious. The kids at my old school, they didn't have luck. No, they didn't. Can we help them? Sarah pulled her daughter close, feeling tears threaten. Yes, sweetheart. We can. The scholarship fund expanded. Sarah worked with administrators at Emma's former school to identify families in crisis, providing assistance that was structured to preserve dignity. Rent payments made anonymously, school supplies delivered without fanfare, small interventions that prevented evictions or kept utilities connected, the kinds of things that had meant the difference between survival and collapse in her own recent past. She didn't seek recognition for these actions, but gratitude found her anyway. A mother she had never met sent a letter describing how an unexpected payment had kept her family housed. A father stopped her outside the school to thank her for supplies his daughter needed, but he couldn't afford. Each expression of gratitude felt heavy, a reminder of how easily fortune could turn, how recently she had been the one needing help instead of giving it. The submarine itself became something of a local legend. Salvage operations had finally removed it from the bay, transporting it to a facility where it would be dismantled for scrap. Local news covered the removal with aerial footage that showed the vessel being lifted from the water, rust streaming from its hull, its conning tower still tilted at that distinctive angle. Sarah watched the coverage from her living room, Emma beside her, and felt a complicated mix of emotions. The submarine had been a burden when she bought it, a symbol of desperation and poor judgment. But it had also been salvation, a vessel that held more than anyone had known. Watching it disappear from the bay felt like losing a strange companion, even as she recognized it was just metal and rust, significant only because of what it had contained. Are you sad? Emma asked. A little, but mostly grateful. Do you think you would have bought it if you knew what was inside? Sarah considered the question seriously. No. If I had known, I would have been too scared. I wouldn't have believed it could work out the way it did. So, the not knowing was good? Sometimes ignorance and desperation look a lot like courage. And sometimes that's enough. A year after the settlement, Sarah received an invitation to speak at a conference on economic mobility and financial security. The organization was legitimate. Their mission aligned with causes she cared about, but the idea of public speaking terrified her. She had spent so long trying to remain invisible that the thought of standing before strangers and sharing her story felt like exposure she couldn't afford. But the invitation came with a request that changed her mind. They wanted her to speak specifically about the psychology of poverty, about the decisions people made when all options were bad, about how desperation shaped risk assessment. They wanted her to help others understand what it felt like to gamble everything because you had nothing to lose. Sarah accepted. She prepared remarks that were honest to the point of discomfort, when refusing to soften the desperation or reframe recklessness as wisdom. When she stood before the audience, a mix of policymakers, academics, and nonprofit workers, her hands shook, but her voice remained steady. I didn't buy that submarine because I was brave, she began. I bought it because I was 3 months behind on rent and facing eviction. I bought it because every traditional path to stability had closed to me. I bought it because when you are drowning, you grab for anything that floats, even if it looks ridiculous to people watching from shore. She spoke about the mockery, about the weight of judgment from people who had never stood where she stood. She spoke about the terror of climbing into that vessel, about the moment she found the diamonds and couldn't believe they were real. And she spoke about what came after, the legal battles, the scrutiny, the way wealth changed how people saw her without changing who she was. I got lucky, she said, meeting eyes in the audience. Extraordinarily, impossibly lucky. But luck isn't a policy recommendation. Luck isn't something we can rely on for everyone struggling to make rent and feed their children. The systems that made me desperate enough to buy a submarine are the same systems that trap millions of others. The difference is, they won't find diamonds. They'll just keep struggling. And they deserve better than to wait for luck that will never come. The response was overwhelming. People approached her afterward with stories of their own struggles, their own desperate gambles. Some had succeeded. Most hadn't. Sarah listened to each one, recognizing the common thread, the impossibility of making good decisions when all the options were bad, and the cruel judgment that followed regardless of outcome. The speaking engagement led to others. Sarah found herself becoming an unlikely voice on economic policy, invited to panels and conferences where her experiential knowledge complemented academic theory. She spoke about poverty with an authority that came from having lived it, refusing to let comfort distance her from recent memory. But the most significant confrontation came not on a stage, but in a parking lot outside a community center where she was volunteering. Sarah was loading supplies into her car when a woman approached, her expression hostile. "You're the submarine woman." Sarah turned, recognizing the tone if not the face. "That's one way to describe me. You think you're so special. Think finding money makes you better than the rest of us working our asses off." Sarah felt anger flash hot in her chest, but she forced herself to pause, to really look at the woman. She saw exhaustion in the lines around her eyes, saw the defeat in her posture, saw herself from 18 months ago reflected back. "I don't think I'm special," Sarah said quietly. "I think I'm lucky. And I think luck is a terrible system to rely on for survival. Easy to say when you're the one who got lucky. You're right. It is easy for me to say now. but I remember what it felt like before. I remember calculating whether to pay rent or buy my daughter new shoes. I remember the shame of using food stamps while people in line behind me sighed impatiently. I remember all of it, and I'm trying to use what happened to me to make things better for people still living that way. The woman's hostility faltered slightly. How? By giving charity that makes you feel good about yourself? By supporting policies that address root causes? By funding organizations that provide real assistance without judgment? And yeah, sometimes by giving money directly to people who need it, because I remember needing it and not getting it. They stood in silence for a moment. Then the woman spoke again, her voice softer. My daughter goes to the school where you set up that scholarship. She got new glasses because of it. Glasses she needed 2 years ago, but we couldn't afford. Sarah felt her throat tighten. I'm glad she got them. I wanted to hate you. It's easier to hate the people who escape than to keep hoping it might happen to you. I know. I hated people like me too, back when I was struggling. I've been where you are. I wish I could promise it gets better, but I can't. All I can do is try to make the struggle a little less impossible for some people. The woman nodded, then walked away without another word. Sarah stood in the parking lot and let tears fall, overwhelmed by the unfairness of it all. She had escaped, but millions hadn't. Her daughter would grow up with opportunities and security, while other children would inherit their parents' struggle. The diamonds had saved her, but they couldn't save everyone. That night, she called her financial advisor and restructured her giving. More money to direct assistance, more to policy advocacy, more to programs that addressed systemic issues rather than individual emergencies. It wouldn't fix everything, but it was something, and something was all she could offer. Emma was 10 now, old enough to understand more of their story than Sarah had initially shared. One evening, sitting together in the living room, Sarah told her daughter the full version. The eviction notice, the desperate bid, the mockery, the discovery, all of it. Emma listened quietly, processing. When Sarah finished, her daughter asked a single question. Are you happy now? Sarah considered carefully. I'm grateful. I'm secure. I'm able to give you things I never thought possible. But happy? I'm still learning what that means. Because you remember being sad? Because I remember being desperate. And knowing that feeling is still happening to other people makes it hard to just enjoy what we have without doing something about it. Emma nodded, wise in the way she had become. I'm glad we can help people. But Mom, it's okay to be happy too. You earned it. Sarah pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the solid warmth of her against her chest. Thank you, sweetheart. The second anniversary of the submarine purchase arrived with less fanfare than Sarah expected. She marked it privately, driving back to the decommissioned naval facility where the vessel had rested. The bay was empty now, the submarine long gone, but the dock remained, weathered and patient. She stood where she had stood 2 years earlier, when she first saw the rusted hulk and questioned every decision that had led her there. The water moved gently against the shore, indifferent to human stories of desperation and discovery. Sarah thought about the woman who had climbed into that submarine, terrified and determined in equal measure. She missed her sometimes, that version of herself. Life had been harder then, impossibly hard, but it had also been simpler. The choices were clear even when they were terrible. Now she had resources beyond measure, and with them came responsibilities she was still learning to navigate. But she wouldn't trade back. Emma had opportunities now. Security. A future that didn't depend on luck or calculated risks. That mattered more than nostalgia for the clarity of survival. Sarah took out her phone and snapped a photo of the empty bay, and then sent it to Emma with a simple message. Where it all changed. Her daughter's response came quickly. Love you, Mom. Proud of you. The words settled into Sarah's chest, warm and solid. Proud of you. Not for finding the diamonds. That was luck, nothing more. But for what she had done with that luck. For the way she had chosen to remember struggle instead of denying it. For the way she had turned fortune into something that reached beyond herself. As she drove away from the facility for the last time, Sarah felt something shift. The weight she had been carrying, the superstitious fear that fortune might reconsider its gift, began to ease. The diamonds were real. The money was real. The transformation of her life was permanent, not a dream that would dissolve upon waking. And more importantly, and she was learning to carry wealth without letting it separate her from the person she had been. The woman who bought a submarine out of desperation hadn't disappeared. She had simply been given resources that matched her determination. 3 years after the discovery, Sarah established a foundation with a name that meant something to her, the Second Chance Fund. Its mission was simple: to provide emergency financial assistance to individuals and families in crisis, with no requirements beyond demonstrated need. No applications filled with intrusive questions. No judgments about how people had reached their circumstances. Just help, offered with the dignity she had wished for during her own struggle. The Foundation's first major initiative funded a program that provided interest-free loans to people facing eviction. But Sarah remembered the notice slipped under her door, remembered the terror of 30 days ticking away. She wanted others to have options she hadn't, bridges across gaps that shouldn't exist. Emma, now a teenager, volunteered with the Foundation during school breaks, helping to process requests and coordinate assistance. She had grown up watching her mother balance gratitude with action, and it had shaped her in ways Sarah found both heartening and humbling. Her daughter understood that wealth was responsibility, not just privilege. On a fall evening, the two of them sat on the porch of their home, watching leaves drift across the yard where Charlie, older now, but still gentle, dozed in the fading light. Emma was working on homework, Sarah reviewing Foundation reports, and the moment felt so ordinary that Sarah almost didn't notice the peace it contained. "Mom," Emma said, not looking up from her book, "do you ever regret it? The submarine?" Sarah set down her papers and thought about the question. "No. Even knowing how hard everything after the discovery was, I wouldn't change it. Because of the money. Because of what the money let us do. For ourselves and for others." She paused, but also because it taught me something important. What? That sometimes the only way forward is through the thing everyone says is impossible, and that judgment from people who haven't stood where you stand doesn't matter as much as doing what you need to survive. Emma nodded, returning to her homework. Sarah watched her daughter work. This child who had endured so much instability and had somehow grown into a person of remarkable strength and compassion. The submarine had changed their external circumstances, but Emma's character had been forged long before fortune intervened. The mockery that once stung felt distant now, echoes from a time when Sarah had needed external validation to confirm her choices. She no longer cared whether people thought her purchase was wise or foolish. The outcome spoke for itself. But more importantly, she had learned to trust her own judgment, even when it contradicted conventional wisdom. She thought about the people who had laughed, who had made jokes about submarines and bad decisions. Some had apologized. Some had simply disappeared from her life. Others had tried to reframe their earlier responses, on claiming they had always believed in her. Sarah had accepted all these reactions with the same measured grace, understanding that people's narratives about her mattered less than the reality she had built. The true vindication wasn't proving them wrong. It was no longer needing their validation to feel secure in her choices. As darkness settled over the yard and lights came on in houses up and down the street, Sarah felt a contentment that had eluded her for so long. Not the fragile relief of temporary stability, but something deeper. The knowledge that she had survived the worst, had gambled everything when the stakes were impossible, and had emerged into a life where safety wasn't conditional on luck holding. The submarine was gone now, dismantled for parts, its components scattered or recycled, so the diamonds were distributed among claimants, transformed from hidden fortune to legal assets divided by agreement. But the truth of what had happened remained, solid and undeniable. A desperate woman had bought what everyone called garbage, had climbed into darkness when every instinct screamed to run, and had found something extraordinary waiting in a vault beneath the sea. And in finding it, she had discovered something even more valuable, that she possessed the courage to act when action seemed impossible, and the wisdom to use fortune for something beyond herself. Years would pass. Emma would grow up, attend college, build her own life with the security and opportunities her mother had fought to provide. Sarah would continue her work with the foundation, expanding its reach, refining its mission, and helping others cross bridges she knew too well. The story of the submarine would fade into family history, a tale told at gatherings with details that grew softer or more dramatic, depending on the mood. But the core truth would remain, that sometimes the thing everyone mocks is the thing that saves you. That desperation can look like courage from the right angle. That judgment from those who haven't walked your path carries no weight worth bearing. And that a rusted submarine, purchased for $600 by a single mother who had nowhere else to turn, could hold within its corroded hull the key to a future no one, least of all her, had dared to imagine. Sarah Chen had bought a submarine. She had been mocked for it, doubted, questioned at every turn. But she had also been right in the only way that mattered. And on quiet evenings, sitting on a porch she owned outright, watching her daughter grow into the person she was always meant to become, Sarah understood that vindication wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about building a life so solid, so rich with meaning and purpose, that their judgment simply ceased to matter at all. The submarine was gone. The struggle was over. But the woman who had climbed into darkness and emerged carrying light, that woman remained, stronger and wiser, ready to help others find their way through impossible choices to the lives they deserved. And that, more than diamonds or money or vindication, was the treasure that would last. The moment Sarah walked into the diner to give her notice, the morning rush was in full swing. The familiar chaos greeted her, orders shouting from the kitchen, the hiss of the griddle, or the clatter of plates being stacked and cleared. She had called ahead to tell the manager she needed to speak with him, but standing in the doorway now, watching the rhythm she had been part of for 3 years, something caught in her throat. Linda, the waitress who had worked the early shift for 15 years, looked up from pouring coffee and froze. The expression that crossed her face was complicated. Recognition, uncertainty, something that might have been shame. She had been one of the people who had laughed when the submarine story first circulated, had made jokes about Sarah's judgment loud enough for the kitchen staff to hear. "Sarah, didn't expect to see you back here." "I need to talk to Marcus," Sarah said quietly, keeping her voice neutral. Linda nodded toward the office at the back, and then returned to her customers without another word. Sarah moved through the dining room, past booths where she had served thousands of meals, past the corner table where the construction worker had made his crack about submarines. The memories pressed against her, not painful exactly, but heavy with recognition of how much had changed. Marcus was in his office, surrounded by invoices and supply orders, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up when she knocked, and his expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something resigned. "You're quitting." It wasn't a question. Sarah sat in the folding chair across from his desk, the same chair where she had begged for advance paychecks, for flexible schedules when Emma was sick, for understanding when she was 10 minutes late because the bus hadn't come. "I'm quitting," she confirmed. Marcus removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Can't say I blame you. Congratulations, by the way. On the everything. Thank you. You were a good worker, Sarah. One of the best I've had. Never complained. Always showed up. Worked harder than people who didn't have half your reasons to be tired." He paused, turning a pen over in his hands. "I'm sorry about what some of the staff said. When the news first got around." Sarah hadn't expected the apology. "You heard? Hard not to, in a place this size. I should have shut it down faster than I did. Should have reminded people that your life wasn't their entertainment." He met her eyes. "For what it's worth, I never thought you were crazy. Desperate, maybe, but not crazy." The distinction felt important, though Sarah wasn't sure why. "I was both. Well, probably. Yeah. Well, desperation makes people do extraordinary things sometimes." Marcus pulled out a final paycheck and slid it across the desk. "There's a little extra in there. Severance, I guess. Or back pay for all the times I should have given you a raise and didn't." Sarah took the envelope, feeling its slight weight. 3 years of her life, thousands of hours on her feet, countless interactions with customers who never knew her name or her story. All of it reduced to a final payment that represented maybe 2 days' interest on the accounts now managed in her name. "What will you do?" Marcus asked. "I don't know yet. Figure out what it means to not have to do anything, I suppose." "Sounds terrifying." Sarah laughed, surprised by how accurate the observation was. "It really is." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Marcus, thank you for giving me this job when I needed it, for not asking too many questions about why I needed it, for the advances and the flexible scheduling and all the small kindnesses you probably don't even remember." His eyes grew bright behind his glasses. "Good luck, Sarah. You and that little girl of yours." Walking out of the diner felt like shedding a skin. The mid-morning air was cool, carrying the smell of exhaust and distant rain. Sarah stood on the sidewalk and looked back through the window at Linda, at the line cooks, at the daily grind continuing without her. She felt unmoored, cut loose from routine that had defined her for so long. Her phone buzzed. A text from the wealth manager reminding her about an appointment to discuss investment portfolios and estate planning. The juxtaposition was so stark, it felt absurd. Yesterday's waitress, today's client requiring specialized financial services. She typed a confirmation and slipped the phone back into her pocket, still not quite believing any of it was real. The first major expense Sarah made, after securing their housing and addressing immediate needs, was hiring a private investigator to locate Emma's father. She had been 23 when she got pregnant, involved with a man who talked about futures that never materialized. When she told him about the baby, he had disappeared so completely, it was as if he had never existed. No forwarding address, no contact information that still worked, nothing but absence where a person had been. For years, she had told herself it didn't matter. Emma was hers, fully and completely, and they didn't need him. But now, gone with resources that made impossible things possible, the question nagged at her. Not because she wanted him in their lives, but because Emma deserved to know. Deserved the option to make her own choices about whether that absence should continue. The investigator was a woman in her 50s who worked from a small office that smelled of coffee and old paper. She listened to Sarah's story without judgment, taking notes in neat handwriting that filled page after page of a yellow legal pad. "I can probably find him," she said when Sarah finished. "People don't disappear as completely as they think they do. But Miss Chen, I have to ask, are you prepared for what you might find? He could be remarried, have other children, have built a life that doesn't include room for the daughter he abandoned." Sarah had thought about this extensively. "I'm not looking to disrupt his life. I just want Emma to have the option to know where she came from, if she wants it, when she's older and can make that choice for herself. And if he wants to reconnect, wants to be part of her life now that you have means?" The implication stung, but Sarah forced herself to consider it seriously. "Then we'll deal with that. But Emma's welfare comes first, always." The investigator found him in 6 weeks. He was living 3 states away, working in sales, married with 2 young children. The investigator's report included photographs taken from a distance. A man who looked older than Sarah remembered, playing with kids in a suburban yard that spoke of middle-class stability. Sarah sat with the report for 3 days before deciding what to do with it. She stored it in a safe deposit box, along with a letter she wrote to Emma explaining everything. When her daughter turned 18, she would have access to both. Until then, Sarah would carry the knowledge alone, protecting Emma from choices she wasn't ready to make. The decision brought a strange peace. She had done what she could. The rest would unfold in its own time. Emma's transition to the new school had not been seamless, despite all the resources Sarah could provide. The students there came from wealth that was generational, inherited, understood as birthright rather than surprise. Emma, with her thrift store instincts and her memories of struggle still sharp, stood out in ways that made her self-conscious. Sarah only learned about the bullying when the school counselor called. A group of girls had discovered Emma's background, the old apartment, and the mother who had worked as a waitress, the sudden acquisition of wealth through what they termed dumb luck. They had made comments, subtle and cutting, about people who didn't belong trying to pretend they did. The meeting with the counselor, the girls' parents, and the school administration was tense. Sarah sat in a conference room that probably cost more than her old apartment's annual rent, and listened to parents defend their daughter's behavior as kids being kids, while simultaneously suggesting that Emma needed to develop thicker skin. Something hardened in Sarah during that meeting. She had spent years absorbing judgment, accepting that her struggles were somehow her fault, that poverty was a personal failing rather than a systemic issue. But watching these comfortable people dismiss her daughter's pain because it was inconvenient for them ignited anger she had been suppressing for too long. "Let me be clear," Sarah said, her voice quiet, but sharp enough to cut through their justifications. "My daughter has survived things your children can't imagine. She's eaten dinner, wondering if there would be breakfast. She's watched me cry over bills while pretending everything was fine. She's developed more character in her 10 years than most people manage in a lifetime. So when your daughters call her names or mock her background, they're not exposing a weakness. They're revealing their own poverty of empathy and understanding." The room went silent. One mother started to respond, but Sarah continued. "I could move Emma to another school. I could insulate her from this entirely. But then she'd grow up thinking that money should separate us from uncomfortable truths about inequality and struggle. And I refuse to raise her that way. So instead, we're going to stay. And you're going to address this bullying seriously. Because my daughter deserves to be here as much as anyone. And the sooner your children learn that wealth doesn't equal worth, the better people they'll become." The meeting ended with assurances of intervention and monitoring. Sarah didn't know if anything would truly change, but she had drawn a line. Emma wouldn't learn to shrink herself to fit into spaces that didn't want to make room for her. Driving home, Emma was quiet in the passenger seat. Finally, she spoke. "You didn't have to do that. I could have handled it." I know you could have. But you shouldn't have to. I'm not alone. What if they hate me more now? Sarah pulled over, turning to face her daughter fully. Emma, people who hate you for surviving hardship they've never experienced aren't worth your concern. Their opinion says nothing about you and everything about them. You have nothing to prove to anyone except yourself. Emma nodded, tears tracking down her cheeks. Sarah held her daughter while she cried, thinking about all the times she had wanted someone to defend her this way, to stand between her and judgment and say, enough. She couldn't change her own past, but she could shape Emma's present, and that was worth more than all the diamonds in the world. 6 months after the settlement, Sarah received a letter from the federal prosecutor's office. They were investigating the origins of the diamond collection, and they needed her cooperation. The letter was polite but firm, requesting an interview and access to all documentation related to the discovery. The meeting took place in a government building with fluorescent lighting and walls painted in shades of institutional beige. 2 prosecutors sat across from Sarah and her lawyer, their expressions professionally neutral as they outlined what they knew. The consortium that had assembled the diamonds had been involved in more than tax evasion. Evidence suggested connections to conflict zones, to mines where labor conditions violated international law, to networks that moved wealth extracted from violence and exploitation. The diamonds Sarah found represented not just hidden assets, but portable profit from suffering she couldn't fully comprehend. We're not suggesting you did anything wrong, one prosecutor clarified. Your acquisition was legal, and your claim was properly adjudicated. But we need to trace these stones to their sources. Some may need to be returned to countries they were illegally removed from. Others may be held as evidence in ongoing investigations. Sarah felt sick. She had thought of the diamonds as a gift from fortune, an improbable solution to impossible circumstances. Learning they might have histories written in exploitation and harm changed how she understood her own luck. What do you need from me? Complete transparency, access to the stones still in your possession, cooperation with gemological analysis that can trace origins, and testimony if cases go to trial. Sarah agreed without hesitation. The prosecutor seemed surprised by how quickly she consented, but her lawyer understood. This wasn't about protecting her wealth. This was about ensuring that if the diamonds carried darkness in their history, the darkness was exposed rather than perpetuated. The investigation took months. Some diamonds were indeed traced to conflict zones and were repatriated. Others became evidence in cases against individuals who had enriched themselves through exploitation. Sarah's share of the settlement decreased as stones were removed from the pool, but she felt relief rather than resentment. When the final accounting was complete, her portion had decreased by nearly 20%. But the wealth that remained was clean, traced, and documented, free of the shadows that had followed the collection for decades. Sarah slept better, knowing that her fortune, however diminished, wasn't built on suffering she had inadvertently profited from. The prosecutors sent a final letter thanking her for cooperation that had been instrumental in several successful prosecutions. Sarah filed it away, another piece of a story that grew more complex the deeper anyone looked. On Emma's 12th birthday, Sarah took her daughter back to the old apartment building. They parked across the street and sat in the car, looking up at windows that had framed their lives during the hardest years. "Why did you want to come here?" Emma asked. "Because I don't want us to forget. Not the bad parts or the scared parts or the times when we didn't know if we'd make it." Sarah pointed to their old window on the 3rd floor. "That's where you learned to read. Where we made pillow forts and pretended we were camping because we couldn't afford a real vacation. Where I taught you that being poor didn't mean being less than anyone." "I remember being happy there sometimes," Emma said quietly. "Me too. Because we had each other, and that mattered more than what we didn't have." Sarah started the car. But I'm also grateful we don't live there anymore. Grateful that you have opportunities now that were just dreams back then. The submarine changed our circumstances, but it didn't change who we are. I needed you to see that." Emma nodded, understanding in ways that continued to surprise Sarah. Her daughter carried both worlds within her, the memory of struggle and the reality of security, and was learning to honor both without letting either define her completely. As they drove away, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror at the building receding behind them. It looked smaller than she remembered, more weathered, sadder somehow. But it had sheltered them when they needed shelter, had kept them safe while she fought to build something better. And for that, despite everything, she was grateful. The past wasn't something to escape or deny. It was foundation, bedrock, the soil from which everything else had grown. The submarine had lifted them out of poverty, but it was those years of struggle that had given Sarah the strength to handle what came after. And that truth, more than vindication or wealth or the admiration of strangers, was what she wanted Emma to carry forward. The knowledge that survival itself was a victory, and that the person you became while fighting for it was worth more than any treasure discovered by chance. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.